1942, Washington, D.C. In the anxious heart of a nation at war, America's leaders faced a quiet realization: they were blind. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had not only devastated the Pacific Fleet, but also exposed the United States' failure to see what was coming. Intelligence, once dismissed as a European obsession, had suddenly become a matter of survival. From that chaos emerged a restless vision, a centralized organization capable of collecting secrets, sabotaging enemies, and shaping global outcomes from the shadows. At its head stood William Wild Bill Donovan, a decorated World War I hero whose mixture of charm, audacity, and disregard for bureaucratic limits made him both admired and feared. Truman's generals distrusted him, Roosevelt tolerated him, but by mid 1942, he had built the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the first unified American spy agency. Donovan understood that wars were not won solely with tanks or fleets. They were won with information, deception, and will. From an improvised headquarters near the National Mall, he began recruiting an unlikely army: Ivy League scholars, linguists, journalists, and rogues fluent in the arts of persuasion and destruction. Many had never held a weapon, others had escaped occupied Europe with nothing but forged papers and rage. Together they became America's clandestine experiment. The OSS spread across continents in a chaotic sprawl of missions: code breaking in London, sabotage in Burma, guerrilla training in China, propaganda in North Africa. The British shared their methods grudgingly, aware the Americans were inexperienced, yet dangerously ambitious. Within a year, Donovan's men were blowing up rail lines in France and infiltrating Nazi supply routes disguised as locals. By 1943, the OSS had grown into a global organism with tendrils in every theater. Its agents stole enemy plans, smuggled resistance fighters, and charted invasion routes for D-Day. They invented gadgets that bordered on absurd: exploding coal, invisible ink, silenced pistols that rarely worked. But their success lay not in technology, but in unpredictability. The Germans began to fear an invisible network manipulating events behind their lines. Donovan's reports to Roosevelt brimmed with optimism, often exaggerating results to secure more funding. But he believed the moral dimension of secrecy was justified by necessity. For the first time, America fought a shadow war alongside the visible one, yet within the corridors of power, skepticism grew. J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI accused the OSS of amateurism and treason. The military saw Donovan's civilian spies as unmanageable. His allies in London warned that victory would breed fear, that democracies might not relinquish their secret armies once peace returned. Donovan brushed it aside. He envisioned a permanent peacetime intelligence service, a shield against the uncertainty he sensed beyond Germany's defeat. To him, information was civilization's last defense. Late in 1944, OSS officers entered liberated Paris ahead of advancing Allied troops, gathering documents abandoned by the Gestapo. They uncovered detailed files on Soviet espionage operations in Europe, evidence that even as the Red Army fought the Nazis, Stalin was preparing for the post-war world. Donovan read the reports and understood their meaning instantly. The next conflict was already germinating inside the alliance. He dispatched Alan Dulles, his chief in neutral Switzerland, to cultivate German defectors who might reveal Soviet plans. Dulles, discreet and calculating, operated from a villa in Bern, hosting late-night meetings with priests, bankers, and traders. Through him, the OSS glimpsed the complex chessboard that would define the coming decades. Behind the victories, however, the moral fog thickened. OSS missions in the Balkans and Italy sometimes ended in massacres, their agents betrayed by locals or rivals. Field officers manipulated resistance movements, deciding which factions lived or died according to shifting Allied priorities. Espionage demanded ruthlessness, and many of Donovan's recruits discovered they were capable of it. Some would never recover. In internal memos, he praised their courageous improvisation. In truth, he was building the habits of a future empire of secrets, bold, effective, and increasingly detached from oversight. As 1945 approached, Germany's collapse seemed inevitable. Donovan began drafting proposals for a central intelligence service that would survive the peace. He argued that the world would not return to innocence, that secrecy, once unleashed, could not be dismissed. His memoranda to President Roosevelt framed intelligence as the fourth arm of defense, equal to the Army, Navy, and Air Force. But the president's death and the looming end of the war changed everything. Washington's appetite for hidden wars diminished as soldiers prepared to come home. The OSS, built for chaos, faced extinction in victory. 1945, Washington, D.C. Victory had come faster than anyone in the OSS expected, and yet it arrived with an emptiness no one could name. Germany's surrender was supposed to end the chaos, but for those who had lived in the hidden war, peace was far more uncertain. William Donovan walked the halls of his fading organization like a man witnessing his own disappearance. The Office of Strategic Services had grown from a desperate experiment into a global intelligence web, but now its purpose was dissolving. Soldiers were returning home, budgets were collapsing. The mood in Washington had shifted. Americans wanted normal life again, not whispers in the dark. President Harry Truman, who had inherited the war's end after Roosevelt's death, distrusted what Donovan represented. To Truman, the OSS was undemocratic, an elite corps of intellectual adventurers accountable to no one, operating with foreign methods that offended his Missouri pragmatism. Spies, he called them, are a species of outlaws. J. Edgar Hoover whispered in his ear that Donovan's agents were communists, fascists, or both, depending on the day. By September 1945, Truman signed Executive Order 9621, dissolving the OSS entirely. Its research and analysis branch went to the State Department. Its covert operations were buried within the War Department. The United States, for a brief and crucial moment, returned to a world without spies. For Donovan, it was a personal betrayal. He had risked everything to prove that intelligence could be America's unseen shield, yet now the nation seemed determined to forget it had ever needed one. In his final memo to the president, he warned that peace will require intelligence as much as war. Few read it carefully. On the day the OSS officially closed, Donovan left his office with a single suitcase, saluted the flag at half-mast, and walked into history. To most of Washington, he was a relic of wartime improvisation. But to the officers he trained, the analysts, cryptographers, and agents scattered across continents, he was a prophet cast out too soon. Those officers found themselves stranded. Some returned to academia, others to journalism or business. Yet many refused to give up the only world they knew, one of secrets, networks, and silent wars. In occupied Europe, They saw the Soviet Union expanding its grip over Eastern capitals Warsaw, Budapest, Bucharest. Cables from American embassies grew grim. Stalin's intelligence services were dismantling resistance groups, arresting former OSS contacts, and building a wall of silence around their new empire. To the veterans of the OSS, the danger was obvious. The war's end had only redrawn the battlefield. Among those displaced officers was Alan Dulles, the quiet lawyer who had run the OSS station in Switzerland. Dulles had spent the war cultivating informants from every corner of Europe industrialists, priests, defecting officers, men who traded scraps of information for safety. He saw the end of the OSS that's not as a closure, but as an opportunity. The world, he believed, was entering a permanent state of tension, one that required professionals of manipulation. From his townhouse in Georgetown, he began meeting former operatives, journalists, and sympathetic congressmen, arguing that America could not afford to fight the next war blind. In one of those meetings sat Frank Wisner, another OSS veteran, recently returned from the Balkans. Wisner had seen firsthand how quickly liberation turned to Soviet domination. He described trains loaded with political prisoners heading east, partisan movements crushed overnight, and the speed with which Moscow's intelligence filled every vacuum. He and Dulles agreed. The United States had underestimated its new ally. The enemy no longer wore uniforms. It operated in ministries, newspapers, and trade unions. To counter that, America would need a new type of soldier, but the political landscape in Washington was poisonous. The military and the FBI each wanted control of intelligence. The State Department lobbied for its own secret service. No one trusted anyone else. Reports overlapped, contradictions piled up, and crucial signals from Europe went unheeded. Soviet networks penetrated post-war governments faster than Washington could identify them. Even as U.S. troops demobilized, Stalin's agents were embedding themselves across Europe's reconstruction. The OSS's disbandment had created exactly what Donovan had warned about: a vacuum. 1946, Washington, D.C. The war was over, but in the corridors of the State Department and the Pentagon, there was a strange unease, the sense that victory had birthed something uncertain. For the first time in its history, the United States stood as the dominant global power, yet it lacked the one thing its new adversary possessed in abundance: intelligence. The Soviet Union had entire ministries devoted to secrecy. America had only fragments, analysts buried inside departments that refused to cooperate. The OSS was gone, replaced by a chaotic patchwork of agencies guarding their own information like fiefdoms. Reports arrived late, filtered through rival bureaucrats, and were often useless by the time they reached the president's desk. In this confusion, a quiet competition began among former OSS veterans. Each believed they understood what a permanent intelligence service should be. At the center of it was Alan Dulles, the urbane ex-OSS officer who had run clandestine operations in neutral Switzerland. He had seen firsthand the way the Soviets infiltrated post-war Europe, the speed with which they captured scientific data, political influence, and human assets before the Americans even knew they existed. To Dulles, it was proof of a coming Cold War. The Soviets would not challenge the United States on open battlefields. They would win through secrecy, deception, and fear. From his Georgetown home, Dulles began holding small evening gatherings. Guests included Frank Wisner, George Kennan, and a handful of like minded diplomats who believed America was drifting into blindness. They called themselves, half jokingly, the survivors of the secret war. Over whiskey and cigarette smoke, they debated the shape of the next intelligence system. Should it serve military strategy or political strategy? Should it act only as an observer or as a weapon? Dulles insisted it had to be both, an organization free from bureaucracy, able to act before policy caught up. He believed the United States could not defend freedom unless it learned to master secrecy. Meanwhile, the political climate was shifting. Reports from Eastern Europe painted a grim picture: communist takeovers, puppet governments, disappearances of opposition leaders. American embassies sent desperate cables warning that the Soviet security services were dismantling entire societies. Inside those cables lay the justification Dulles and Wisner needed. They began circulating memoranda arguing that the United States faced a global ideological conflict conducted through covert means. To fight it, they said, the country would need a new kind of soldier, one who fought wars without front lines. President Truman, still cautious of secret agencies, reluctantly approved the formation of a temporary Central Intelligence Group, CIG, in early 1946. It was meant to coordinate information between departments, not to conduct operations. The CIG had no authority to run spies, no power to protect its sources, and no independent budget. It was intelligence by committee, and therefore ineffective. But within the shadows of its failure, opportunity bloomed. Dulles and Wisner saw it as the necessary first step towards something permanent. They quietly funneled former OSS operatives into the CIG's analysis divisions, embedding a culture that believed espionage was a strategic instrument, not a temporary necessity. Across the Atlantic, the situation worsened. Soviet intelligence networks, led by the NKVD and its successor, the MGB, expanded rapidly through Eastern Europe. American agents operating under diplomatic cover were being watched, followed, sometimes abducted. In Vienna, Berlin, and Prague, invisible borders hardened between East and West. To veterans of the OSS, it felt as though a new war had begun, one fought in safe houses, back alleys, and conference rooms instead of trenches. The psychological balance of power was shifting, and Dulles understood that information, not armies, would decide who ruled the post-war world. Inside Washington, bureaucratic rivalry turned poisonous. The FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, claimed that only domestic security mattered. The military intelligence branches wanted control of foreign spying. The State Department demanded oversight. Truman, weary of their squabbles, issued orders that changed little. America had created the world's most powerful weapons, but was stumbling into the next era blindfolded. Dulles grew convinced that only an independent civilian agency could survive such infighting. By late 1946, as Churchill's warning about an Iron Curtain echoed across Europe, Truman began to grasp the scale of the Soviet threat. His advisors pressed for decisive action. The world was dividing into two camps, and the United States would have to pick up where the OSS had left off, or risk losing the peace it had just won. 1946, Fulton, Missouri. On a cold March afternoon, the echo of footsteps filled the hall of Westminster College as Winston Churchill rose to deliver a speech that would define the New World Order. Standing beside President Truman, He declared that an iron curtain has descended across the continent. It was not mere rhetoric, it was prophecy. Behind that curtain, Soviet power had already enveloped Eastern Europe, and in Washington, the word struck like an alarm. What had been a vague unease turned overnight into a doctrine of suspicion. The alliance that had defeated Hitler was dissolving into silence and espionage. In the aftermath of Churchill's warning, U.S. diplomats in Moscow and Warsaw sent cables filled with dread. They described the Sovietization of entire societies. Newspapers shuttered, opposition leaders jailed, resistance movements erased. The Soviet intelligence services, the MGB, operated with mathematical precision, replacing open politics with invisible control. For men like Alan Dulles and Frank Wisner, still haunted by the disbandment of the OSS, the implications were immediate. America had no defense in this new kind of war. The Soviets understood the power of information. The United States still treated it as an afterthought. Inside the State Department, the newly formed Central Intelligence Group, CIG, was already failing. Lacking authority and vision, it became a bureaucratic backwater. Analysts complained that the White House received conflicting reports about the same events. By the time information reached President Truman, it was weeks old. Soviet propaganda, by contrast, was instantaneous, a coordinated global voice accusing the West of imperialism while advancing its own empire under the banner of liberation. The imbalance was clear. America had firepower, but no foresight. Alan Dulles watched the situation from the periphery, acting unofficially as an advisor. He had begun corresponding with George Kennan, the U.S. diplomat in Moscow, whose long telegram warned that the Kremlin's aim was global ideological expansion. Kennan's analysis became gospel within Washington's emerging circle of Cold Warriors. It provided the intellectual foundation for what would soon be called containment, the strategy of resisting Soviet influence everywhere at any cost. For Dulles and Wisner, containment meant one thing: covert action. While policymakers debated, Wisner moved quietly. In 1946, he was appointed to head the State Department's Office of Special Projects, an innocuous title that concealed its true purpose: to organize propaganda and covert networks against the Soviets. Wisner, still scarred by what he had witnessed in Eastern Europe, called it a fight for the soul of the world. His office began funding anti-communist newspapers, student movements, and exiled resistance groups scattered across post-war Europe. The mission was simple but immense: to prove democracy could survive secrecy. Meanwhile, Dulles operated as the philosopher of the underground. To him, Churchill's Iron Curtain was not just a metaphor, it was a frontier of intelligence. He argued that the United States needed permanent capabilities: espionage, psychological warfare, and political subversion equal to the Soviet machine. He pressed sympathetic senators, wrote essays under pseudonyms, and convened informal gatherings of ex-OSS officers to discuss logistics, funding, and recruitment. His influence spread quietly through Washington's think tanks and drawing rooms, where the language of moral defense began blending with that of covert manipulation. President Truman, cautious but increasingly alarmed, approved modest expansions to the CIG. Yet the machinery of government could not match the speed of events. In 1947, communist parties gained ground in France and Italy. In Greece, a civil war erupted between royalists and Soviet-backed insurgents. In Turkey, The Kremlin demanded control of the Dardanelles. Truman realized the pattern. The Soviets were advancing not through armies, but through infiltration. For the first time, he spoke openly of a war of ideas. In secret, the outlines of America's response were forming. Dulles and Wisner's allies drafted plans for a centralized organization capable of defending democracy with deception. It would collect intelligence, conduct propaganda, and, when necessary, act without acknowledgement. It would be neither military nor civilian, yet tied directly to the presidency. The Iron Curtain, in the end, did more than divide Europe. It divided time. The old world of open conflict was over. The new world of hidden wars had begun. And within that gray frontier, between fact and belief, freedom and control, America's next institution was already taking shape, born from the fear that ignorance was more dangerous than immorality. 1947, Washington, D.C. The ink was still wet on the Truman Doctrine when the United States quietly began building its new architecture of power. The president had gone before Congress to declare that America would support free peoples resisting subjugation, a pledge that transformed containment from theory into policy. But beneath the rhetoric, something else was forming, a secret infrastructure to make that policy enforceable. The fear of Soviet expansion had hardened into strategy, and with it came the realization that ideology could not be fought in the open. It had to be fought in silence. Throughout 1947, the government's attention turned to the one question left unanswered since the war: who would gather, interpret, and act upon the world's secrets? The Central Intelligence Group had proven toothless, trapped between departments that refused to share information. The military viewed intelligence as its domain. The State Department wanted political control. Hoover's FBI demanded domestic jurisdiction. In this chaos, the former OSS officers, Allen Dulles, Frank Wisner, and their allies, saw an opening. They drafted memoranda arguing that the United States needed a permanent civilian intelligence agency, one capable not only of analysis, but also of covert action. Dulles became the movement's strategist. He leveraged his wartime network of diplomats, financiers, and journalists to lobby Congress behind the scenes. Wisner, now running the State Department's covert propaganda branch, supplied vivid examples of Soviet operations in Eastern Europe: kidnappings, forged elections, puppet regimes. Their message was simple: without a centralized service, the United States would remain reactive, forever one step behind the Kremlin. Truman, pragmatic but wary, agreed to listen. The solution arrived in the form of the National Security Act of 1947, a sweeping reorganization of the American defense system. It created the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, and a new intelligence agency, the Central Intelligence Agency. On paper, its mission was modest: to coordinate intelligence from various departments and report to the President. In practice, the wording of Section 102(d)(5), authorizing such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the National Security Council may direct, opened a vast legal gray zone. Within that single clause lay the birthright of covert action. When Truman signed the act on September 18, 1947, few understood its implications. There was no fanfare, no parade, only a quiet transfer of authority from temporary wartime improvisation to permanent secrecy. The CIA began as a handful of offices scattered around Washington, led by Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, a cautious bureaucrat with little taste for espionage. But inside its walls, a new culture took root, half analytical, half operational, and filled with former OSS men restless for purpose. They saw themselves not as administrators, but as pioneers of an invisible frontier. Early missions revealed both ambition and chaos. In Europe, newly minted CIA officers attempted to run networks of anti communist agents behind the Iron Curtain. Most ended in disaster. Soviet counterintelligence, far more experienced, intercepted their codes, captured couriers, and turned double agents. In one instance, a CIA backed resistance group in Albania was annihilated before its first broadcast. The failures were catastrophic, but they also confirmed what Dulles had long argued. The United States had entered a war of intelligence, and retreat was impossible. Wisner watched these disasters with grim resolve. Rather than scale back, he proposed expansion, a professional branch dedicated to psychological warfare and covert operations, insulated from the bureaucracy. He called it the Office of Policy Coordination. Though officially under the State Department, it drew its funding and orders directly from the CIA. In effect, it became America's first peacetime covert action service, with Wisner as its architect. From propaganda newspapers in Rome to clandestine radio stations in Berlin, the machinery of influence began to hum. Truman himself remained skeptical of spies, yet he could not ignore results. Intelligence now shaped diplomacy, elections, and reconstruction efforts across Europe. The Marshall Plan provided the money, the CIA provided the persuasion. Together, they rebuilt the Western world's political shield against communism. By year's end, the new agency had outgrown its offices and its legal limits. The United States had built what Donovan once imagined, a standing intelligence service bound not by war but by ideology. 1948, Eastern Europe and Washington, D.C. The year after the CIA's creation began with silence, a deceptive calm before the agency's true work began. Across Europe, communist regimes consolidated power under Moscow's supervision. In February, a coup in Czechoslovakia toppled the last democratic government east of Vienna. The message was unmistakable. The Soviet Union had no intention of stopping at its wartime borders. In Washington, fear hardened into purpose. The young CIA, barely organized, was suddenly tasked with defending a world order through means no one would publicly admit existed. Within the agency, Frank Wisner's Office of Policy Coordination, OPC, became the nucleus of covert action. It operated in basements, rented apartments, and repurposed wartime offices, recruiting linguists, journalists, and veterans from the OSS. Their task was to conduct psychological warfare, a euphemism for propaganda, subversion, and clandestine political manipulation. Wisner called it the mighty Wurlitzer, a machine capable of playing any tune the United States required. He believed that to fight totalitarianism, democracy had to master its own brand of secrecy. At the same time, Allen Dulles, still on the agency's margins, acted as its informal strategist. He understood that the Cold War would be won not by armies, but by perception, the image of control, the illusion of omniscience. From his Georgetown living room, he mentored younger officers, urging them to think in global terms. We must build a service that sees everywhere and is seen nowhere. His words became doctrine. The CIA's first large-scale operations tested that philosophy. In Italy, the agency faced a direct challenge. Communist parties threatened to win national elections, potentially bringing Western Europe's third largest country into Moscow's orbit. Under Wisner's direction, funds flowed covertly to centrist political groups, Catholic organizations, and friendly newspapers. Suitcases of cash moved through embassies. Radio broadcasts flooded the air with anti communist rhetoric. The Vatican quietly endorsed the effort. When the election came in April 1948, the communists lost. Officially, democracy had triumphed. Unofficially, the CIA had conducted its first foreign intervention, and it had worked. Inside Washington, the success electrified policymakers. Truman's advisors saw in the operation a model for the future, small, invisible, decisive. The Marshall Plan provided the public face of Reconstruction. The CIA supplied the hidden hand steering its outcomes. Wisner's OPC expanded overnight, drawing in hundreds of operatives and millions in untraceable funding. Covert action, once a desperate wartime improvisation, became formal U.S. policy. But beneath the triumph ran unease. Reports from Eastern Europe described failed infiltration attempts, CIA agents captured, tortured, or executed after parachuting behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviet MGB and GRU seemed always one step ahead. Later declassified documents would show why. The CIA's European networks were riddled with double agents. Each success was shadowed by betrayal. Wisner's optimism began to fray. The agency had inherited Donovan's boldness, but lacked his simplicity. Every operation carried the weight of moral compromise. Meanwhile, within the CIA's analytical branch, a new culture was forming, detached, statistical, and secretive. Analysts pored over intercepted cables, refugee testimonies, and scraps of economic data to predict Soviet intentions. Yet even the data fed the illusion of certainty. No one could tell where information ended and assumption began. The agency was learning that intelligence, like power, was self-consuming. Late that year in Berlin, a crisis erupted that tested both the agency and the West itself. The Soviets blockaded the city, cutting off supplies to its western sectors. The world teetered on the edge of confrontation. As American planes began the Berlin airlift, the CIA scrambled to gather intelligence on Soviet military movements. Behind the headlines, Wisner's networks smuggled messages, photographs, and defectors through the occupied zones. For the first time, intelligence, logistics, and ideology merged into a single front. When the blockade finally lifted in May 1949, the message was clear. The Cold War had entered full view. The CIA, still officially small and experimental, had proven indispensable, but it had also discovered the paradox of its own success, that every covert victory demanded deeper secrecy, and every failure could never be admitted. Within its anonymous offices, the young agency stood at a crossroads. The men who built it, Dulles, Wisner, and their circle, believed they were defending freedom. Yet the methods they forged were beginning to resemble those of their enemies. The transformation was quiet, almost invisible, but irreversible. The CIA had crossed from observation into manipulation. 1950, Washington, D.C. A new decade began with unease. The Cold War was no longer an abstract rivalry. It was a system of permanent tension. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb in August 1949, shattering America's monopoly on nuclear power. In China, Mao's revolution had triumphed, giving communism a billion new adherents. Within months, Washington was consumed by panic. To many in Congress and the Pentagon, these were not isolated events, but proof of a coordinated global offensive. And in the middle of it all stood a young, still untested agency, the CIA, charged with explaining how it had all happened without warning. The pressure transformed the organization overnight. President Truman demanded answers, Congress demanded scapegoats, and the Joint Chiefs demanded intelligence on every continent at once. The CIA expanded rapidly, absorbing former OSS officers, economists, and military analysts into a swelling bureaucracy. Roscoe Hillenkoetter, the agency's cautious director, struggled to control it. Inside the State Department, Frank Wisner's Office of Policy Coordination, OPC, had become nearly autonomous, operating vast networks across Europe with little oversight. Funds were hidden in defense budgets, personnel in embassies. What had begun as a small experiment in psychological warfare was evolving into a shadow government of its own. At the center of this quiet expansion stood Allen Dulles, still officially a private citizen, but increasingly treated as the agency's philosopher and conscience. He was called to testify before congressional committees and to advise the National Security Council. His message was always the same. Secrecy was no longer a temporary necessity. It was the foundation of modern power. The Cold War, he told one senator, is not a conflict we can end, only one we must manage. Those words became gospel within Langley's corridors. Events soon vindicated him. In June 1950, North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel, launching the Korean War. American troops rushed to defend the South, but intelligence failures were immediate. The CIA had underestimated the attack and possessed no reliable assets inside the North. The shock forced Truman to authorize emergency measures, granting the agency unprecedented latitude. Covert branches expanded into Asia, funding anti-communist militias, manipulating trade unions, and infiltrating political movements from Seoul to Saigon. For the first time, the CIA's reach became global. Within headquarters, a new generation of officers arrived, idealists turned pragmatists. They believed information could steer history if wielded correctly. Wisner embodied that faith. He spoke of an invisible line running through every society, separating those who sought freedom from those who served tyranny. His job, he said, was to pull that line toward the West. Under his direction, the OPC funneled resources into propaganda stations like Radio Free Europe, cultural fronts, and student exchanges, all designed to project American values under the veil of independence. The instruments were subtle, but the goal was absolute influence. Yet even as operations multiplied, unease spread. Reports from the field detailed failed missions and compromised networks. The Soviets seemed to anticipate every move. Inside the agency, whispers began about leaks, moles, and traitors. James Jesus Angleton, a young counterintelligence officer fascinated by deception, warned that Soviet penetration might reach the highest levels. Paranoia took hold, a psychological Cold War within the institution itself. Files were locked away, colleagues monitored one another, and trust eroded in proportion to secrecy. The Korean conflict deepened that divide. As American and Chinese troops clashed across the peninsula, the CIA's role blurred between intelligence and covert warfare. Agents trained guerrillas, coordinated supply drops, and managed disinformation campaigns that even the Pentagon could not fully trace. For Wisner, it was vindication. For Truman, a warning. The agency designed to prevent surprise attacks was now conducting its own hidden offensives. By late 1951, the United States had become what it had once feared to be, a nation permanently mobilized for invisible conflict. The CIA's authority grew precisely because its results could never be measured. Every disaster could be disguised as a lesson, every success as proof of necessity. The war in Korea raged openly, but the greater struggle for global perception, for the invisible loyalties of men, was being fought behind closed doors. And within those doors, Dulles' quiet prophecy had come true. Secrecy was no longer an instrument of policy, it was policy itself. 1953, Tehran, Iran. By 1953, the Central Intelligence Agency was no longer a fledgling experiment. It had become an instrument of statecraft. The Korean War had ended an uneasy stalemate, but its lessons lingered. Ideology could not be contained by armies alone. The real battlefield was political will. Inside the agency, Alan Dulles had finally ascended to director, replacing Admiral Hillenkoetter. Alongside him, Frank Wisner controlled the Office of Policy Coordination, now formally merged into the CIA's Covert Operations Branch. Together, they transformed Donovan's wartime improvisation into a global system of manipulation. Their first true test came in Iran, a nation whose future had become entangled with the West's need for oil and stability. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a nationalist with broad public support, had moved to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, threatening British control over one of the world's richest petroleum reserves. London fumed, Washington hesitated, and then, as the Cold War logic took hold, the decision was made. Mossadegh's defiance was not just economic rebellion, it was potential alignment with Moscow. The solution would not be diplomatic, it would be covert. Under the codename Operation TP-AJAX, the CIA and Britain's MI6 set out to remove Mossadegh and restore the Shah to full power. The mission, overseen by Dulles and executed in the field by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., was a synthesis of everything the young agency had learned: propaganda, deception, and psychological warfare orchestrated into a single plan. Agents bribed newspaper editors to publish anti-Mossadegh stories. Street mobs were paid to create chaos, then photographed as evidence of communist plots. Army officers, loyal to the Shah, were quietly assured of American backing. Each action was a small manipulation, insignificant alone, but together they built a reality no one could challenge. In mid-August, the operation seemed to falter. Mossadegh's security forces arrested several conspirators, and Roosevelt considered evacuation. But Dulles ordered persistence. Money continued to flow through Tehran's black markets. Rumors of coups within coups circulated. On August 19th, 1953, loyalist troops and hired crowds converged on the capital. By nightfall, Mossadegh's residence was in ruins, and the Shah's authority restored. Officially, the uprising appeared spontaneous. In truth, it was the CIA's first successful regime change. The victory electrified Washington. For the first time, covert action had altered the course of a nation without open warfare. President Eisenhower, newly inaugurated, saw in Dulles a weapon uniquely suited to the Cold War: invisible, flexible, and deniable. Within months, funding for covert operations tripled. Wisner's networks expanded into Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. To policymakers, Iran was proof that America could steer history from the shadows. To Dulles, it was vindication. The agency had evolved beyond intelligence into the engineering of reality. But beneath the triumph lay consequences no one yet understood. Mossadegh's overthrow would haunt the Middle East for decades, sowing resentment that would one day explode. Inside the CIA, the operation hardened a new mindset: intervention as default, secrecy as justification. Success in Tehran became the model for future actions in Guatemala, Indonesia, and beyond. Each new mission drew on the same template: fabricate instability, guide public perception, and let the desired outcome appear inevitable. For Wisner, however, the glow of victory carried a darker tone. He had seen too many men and movements destroyed by the machinery he'd built. The exhilaration of control was giving way to fatigue. He began to question whether the defense of freedom still resembled the ideal he'd once served. Dulles dismissed such doubts as sentimentality. History, he told a colleague, is written by those who control information. The agency that had been born from wartime necessity was now an empire of influence, moving presidents and governments alike. From its modest offices, it could bend the fate of nations, unseen and unaccountable. Iran proved what was possible and what was irreversible. 1954, Washington, D.C., Guatemala City. Success in Iran had given the CIA something far more potent than authority. It had given it confidence. Alan Dulles now stood as both the agency's architect and its myth. The White House trusted him implicitly, and in the glow of Operation Ajax, he promised that American power could be extended quietly, cheaply, and without the mess of war. His doctrine was simple: covert action was diplomacy by other means. When Guatemala elected a reformist president who threatened U.S. interests, Dulles saw another test of that creed. Jacobo Arbenz, a former soldier with nationalist ambitions, had introduced agrarian reforms that expropriated unused land from large corporations, including the powerful United Fruit Company, whose executives had long ties to Washington. To Dulles, it was not simply an economic challenge. It was a potential foothold for communism in the Western Hemisphere. The Cold War lens turned every act of social reform into subversion. And so, within months, the CIA drew up Operation PBSUCESS, its second major coup, a plan to overthrow Arbenz without a single declared battle. The strategy mirrored Iran's, but on a grander scale. Wisner's covert branch orchestrated a campaign of psychological warfare designed to make the Guatemalan government collapse under the weight of its own fear. Radio broadcasts spread rumors of rebel armies approaching the capital. Fake newspapers, printed in Miami, reported on imaginary uprisings. Pilots hired under civilian cover flew sorties, dropping leaflets one day, bombs the next. Rebel forces, numbering only a few hundred men, were inflated through rumor into an invading legion. The illusion became reality as panic spread through Guatemala's military ranks. In June 1954, the coup succeeded. Arbenz resigned, fled the country, and a U.S.-backed regime took power. Washington hailed it as another triumph of quiet precision. Yet even as the White House celebrated, Wisner felt the same unease that had haunted him after Tehran. He knew how much of it had been theater, how easily perception could replace truth. In a report to Dulles, he admitted that the line between information and manipulation no longer exists. Dulles ignored the warning. For him, Guatemala was proof that the CIA had mastered the tools of empire. The agency now operated across 3 continents, funded by secret appropriations and guided by presidential approval so vague it bordered on absolute freedom. But cracks were forming beneath the surface. Soviet propaganda seized on the coup, portraying the United States as a neo colonial power. Across Latin America, nationalist movements hardened against Washington. The very secrecy that ensured deniability also guaranteed misunderstanding. The CIA had become too successful to control and too essential to question. Within its expanding bureaucracy, compartmentalization deepened. Analysts knew little of field operations. Operators knew nothing of policy. Power was dispersed, yet centralized in the mythology of secrecy. At home, McCarthyism gripped the nation, feeding the same paranoia the CIA practiced abroad. Loyalty investigations swept through government offices. Even intelligence officers found themselves accused of subversion. The boundary between defending democracy and distrusting it was vanishing. Wisner, exhausted by constant duplicity, began to fray under the weight of what he called the moral cost of secrecy. He drank heavily, wrote erratic memos, and withdrew from friends. The empire he had helped create was consuming him. Dulles, meanwhile, was untouchable. He briefed Eisenhower directly, bypassing committees, shaping foreign policy with classified reports no one could verify. Under his leadership, the CIA expanded into Asia and Africa, cultivating coups, insurgencies, and propaganda outlets like seeds scattered across the globe. The agency's footprint was everywhere, and yet its existence remained a rumor. By year's end, the United States had discovered that influence could be as intoxicating as victory. The CIA had proven it could remove governments and rewrite realities, all without declaring war. But in that mastery lay its corruption. For the first time, the line between defense and domination blurred completely. 1956, Washington, D.C., Budapest, Hungary. By the mid 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency had become the hidden engine of American power. From Tehran to Guatemala, its influence stretched across continents, and its legend grew inside its own walls. Yet victory had bred illusion. The agency's leaders believed they could shape history itself, that covert action could bend entire nations without consequence. But history was preparing its reckoning. In Eastern Europe, where Soviet control had tightened like a steel grip, rebellion was stirring, and for a moment it seemed the CIA's grand narrative might unravel. In October 1956, the people of Hungary rose against Soviet domination. Crowds tore down Red Stars, stormed prisons, and demanded freedom. Radio stations broadcast pleas for help to the West, voices trembling with hope that America's promise of liberation meant more than words. Inside the CIA, analysts listened in real time, their headphones filled with the sound of gunfire and prayer. But Washington hesitated. The uprising had not been planned or anticipated. No networks, no agents, no prepared channels existed. The same organization that had toppled governments abroad now found itself powerless to save a nation fighting for its own soul. For Allen Dulles, the Hungarian Revolution was a sobering revelation. Intelligence had given him omniscience, but not control. His empire of secrets could manipulate perception, but it could not command reality. As Soviet tanks entered Budapest, the agency's clandestine operators realized that their reach stopped at the borders of Moscow's will. Within days, the revolution was crushed, and thousands were dead. In Washington, silence replaced outrage. The CIA issued assessments, excuses, and cables filled with regret. But beneath the paperwork lay something deeper, the recognition that the agency's power had limits it had never acknowledged. At home, Frank Wisner was unraveling. The strain of a decade spent directing deception had eroded him. He watched the footage from Budapest, students waving torn flags, women carrying rifles through the streets, and saw the failure not as strategic, but moral. His mighty Wurlitzer, as he had called it, could play any tune except truth. Haunted by guilt and paranoia, he began to see betrayal everywhere, within the agency, within himself. Colleagues whispered that he had suffered a breakdown of the mind. In late 1958, he would be quietly relieved of duty. Dulles, outwardly unshaken, pushed forward. Under President Eisenhower, the CIA's global apparatus expanded further. U-2 spy planes soared over Soviet territory, covert arms flowed into Asia, and cultural fronts spread across Europe. The agency had become self-sustaining, fueled by secrecy, insulated from doubt. But beneath its polished reports and confident briefings, disillusionment crept through its ranks. Younger officers questioned whether America's shadow wars were preserving freedom or merely replicating empire by other means. The question had no safe answer. By decade's end, the Cold War had stabilized into a permanent stalemate, a divided world policed by fear and deception. The CIA stood at the center of it all, indispensable, invisible, and untouchable. What had begun in the chaos of World War II as a desperate experiment had become a pillar of American identity. Intelligence was no longer the means to an end, it was the end itself. In his private journals, Dulles wrote that the agency's work was the necessary burden of civilization, but to others, it looked like an institution devouring its creators. Donovan's original dream of noble espionage, the idea that knowledge could safeguard democracy, had hardened into a system where truth was subordinate to strategy. When Wisner died years later, his colleagues avoided the subject. They simply said he had served too long in the shadows. Yet in his downfall lay the agency's reflection, brilliant, relentless, and broken by the weight of its own secrecy. By 1960, the CIA had become everything its founders once feared: an empire without borders, a guardian without oversight. The Cold War was no longer a struggle between nations, but between realities, and the masters of those realities sat behind locked doors in Langley, believing they could control a world they barely understood.